I remember the exact moment I realized I was being erased. I was standing in the hallway outside the boardroom, coffee cooling in my hand, listening to the new chief executive officer present my work as if it had always been his. My name was gone from every slide, every chart, every word. I felt invisible, but not surprised, just tired. The way you get after years of building something you thought would last. Maybe you know that feeling too, the sting of watching someone else take credit for what you poured your life into. So if you're watching this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if something in you recognizes something in this, stay with me. My name is Julia Carter, and for 7 years I was the architect behind Northpoint's medical data platform. I was never the loudest in the room, but I was the one who stayed late, who knew every detail, every client's worry, every quiet promise made in the early days when we were just 5 people sharing a cramped office in Chicago. I believed that if you built something with care, it would last. No matter who came and went, I was wrong. That morning, I stood in the hallway, the city's gray light filtering through the glass, and watched Mark Evans, our new chief executive officer, present my work to the board as if it had always belonged to him. He wore the kind of suit that never wrinkled, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He spoke with certainty, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice when Linda, one of the board members, pressed him about a feature I had designed to protect patient privacy. He dodged the question, pivoted to a chart, and the moment passed. But I saw the flicker of doubt cross her face. I did not move. I did not interrupt. I simply watched, letting the silence fill the space between us. In offices like ours, power shifts quietly. It happens in the way your name disappears from a project, in the way your access is quietly revoked, in the way people who once asked for your advice now avoid your eyes in the elevator. I felt it that morning, the slow, cold drift of being replaced. It was more like standing outside in winter, without a coat and ache that settles in your bones, a numbness that tells you something important has changed. Emma, who had once been my intern and now worked as Mark's assistant, caught my eye as she hurried past with a stack of papers. She hesitated, her mouth opening as if to say something, but then she looked away, her cheeks coloring. I remembered when she first joined, how she would stay late to ask questions, how she once brought me coffee on a Sunday morning when we were racing to meet a deadline. Now she moved quickly, careful not to linger too long near me, as if my presence might be contagious. Inside the boardroom, Mark's voice rose and fell, confident and practiced, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the edge of the podium just a little too tightly. He was selling the board on a future built on my work, but he did not understand what held it together. He did not know about the late nights, the failed prototypes, the quiet compromises that made the system stable. The most important parts were invisible, woven into the structure in ways that could not be seen on a slide. I watched as Linda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, and asked about the system's resilience under pressure. Mark answered, but his words were vague, and I saw another board member glance at her, eyebrows raised. The room was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is starting to wonder if they have missed something important. I felt no urge to step in, no need to defend myself. In places like this, the truth does not need to be shouted. It waits, patient and silent, until someone finally notices the cracks. When the meeting ended, I stayed in the hallway, letting the board members file past me without a word. Mark did not look at me. Emma gave me a small, apologetic smile, but she did not stop. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the echo of my own footsteps in the empty corridor, and thought about all the things I had built that no one else could see. I thought about the promises I had made to myself, about the quiet lines I had drawn in the sand years ago, back when I still believed that loyalty would be enough. If you have ever stood in a hallway like that, watching someone else take credit for what you built, feeling the world shift under your feet, then you already know how this story begins. And if you are still listening, I hope you will stay with me, because what happened next was not about revenge. It was about remembering where things begin, and who still holds the keys when everyone else has forgotten. The meeting ended, but I did not return to my office. Instead, I walked the long way around the floor, past the glass-walled conference rooms and the framed awards that still bore my name in small print. I could feel the shift in the air, people glancing up from their screens, then quickly looking away, as if my presence reminded them of something uncomfortable. I paused by the window, watching the city move below, letting the noise of the office fade behind me. At 9:01, my phone buzzed with a calendar alert. Meeting with Mark and Paul, the head of human resources, in room 5C. No subject, no explanation. I knew what was coming. I had seen it happen to others before: quiet exits, polite statements, the kind of restructuring that always seemed to happen just before a big announcement. My steps echoed on the polished floor as I made my way down the hall. When I entered, Mark was already seated, his tie loosened, eyes fixed on the table. Paul sat across from him, a folder with my name on it resting in his hands. "Julia, thank you for coming," Mark began, his voice careful, almost rehearsed. "We're making some changes ahead of the merger. Your role is no longer part of the plan." He slid a letter across the table, the company logo embossed in blue at the top. Paul handed me a list of access removals, effective immediately. There was no discussion, no offer to stay on in a different capacity, not even a word of thanks for the years I had given. I looked at Mark's outstretched hand, then at Paul's uneasy smile, and realized how quickly loyalty could be rewritten. I did not argue or ask for a reason. I simply folded the letter and placed it in my bag. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. Mark cleared his throat, but whatever he meant to say was lost. I stood, nodded once, and left without looking back. In the hallway, Emma was waiting. She looked nervous, her hands twisting the strap of her bag. "They're announcing the merger this afternoon," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "They're using your strategy deck. Your name isn't on it." I met her eyes, searching for any sign of the eager intern I once knew. She looked away, guilt flickering across her face. "I thought you were leading this," she said quietly. "So did I replied, my voice steady. I walked out of the building into the sharp morning air, the city already alive with the rush of people who had no idea what had just happened on the 18th floor. I did not call anyone or check my messages. Instead, I let the world move around me, each step carrying me further from the place I had poured so much of myself into. For years, I believed that if I worked hard enough, the work would speak for itself. But now, as I stood at the corner waiting for the light to change, I understood that sometimes the people who benefit most from what you build are the first to forget you were ever there. Reaching into my bag, I felt the weight of the letter. Still unopened, I thought about the system I had created, the late nights and early mornings, the quiet pride I had taken in building something that mattered. I remembered the one thing I had done years ago, quietly, without telling anyone. I had protected what I built, just in case. And now, as I crossed the street and disappeared into the crowd, I knew that what they had forgotten would soon become impossible to ignore. When I finally reached my apartment, I left the lights off and set my bag down in the quiet. I stood for a moment, listening to the city outside my window, letting the day's events replay in my mind, then, almost without thinking, I walked to the hallway closet and pulled down a black binder from the top shelf. Inside were the documents I had kept for years, original sketches, integration maps, and, tucked between 2 pages, the license I had filed in my own name. I remembered the night I wrote the application, sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of cold coffee, the city lights flickering outside. Back then, we were just a handful of people with more hope than money, sharing borrowed space and chasing deadlines. I filed the license not because I expected to need it, but because I had seen too many good ideas taken by the wrong people. I wanted to make sure what we built would be safe, even if no one else thought it was necessary. For years, I let the company use the system freely. There were no contracts, no conditions. I believed in the mission and the people, but as the company grew and new faces arrived, the foundation shifted. The people making decisions now did not understand what held everything together. I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found David's number. He was an old friend, a lawyer who had always told me to call if things ever got strange. When he answered, I did not have to explain much. "They just sold something I own," I said quietly. There was a pause. then the slow sound of him sitting down. "Tell me everything," he replied. I gathered the documents, making sure every page was in order. I did not feel anger or satisfaction, just a quiet sense of purpose. I knew that the next move was not mine to make. I had done what I needed to do years ago, quietly, without fanfare. Now, it was their turn to realize what they had overlooked. As I placed the license back in its envelope, I thought about the boardroom that morning, about Mark's confident voice and Linda's sharp questions. I wondered how long it would take for them to understand the ground beneath their feet was not as solid as they believed. I did not plan to make a scene. I did not want revenge. I only wanted the truth to have a cost. The next morning, I woke early, the city still quiet outside my window. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The black binder open in front of me. I read through every page, tracing the lines of my own handwriting, the diagrams drawn late at night when the system was still just an idea. Those early days came back to me, how every small victory felt enormous, how every setback was personal. Now the work felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I called David just after 8. He answered on the first ring, his voice steady and calm. We met at a small cafe downtown, away from the office towers and the people who might recognize us. He wore the same glasses he had in law school, the same habit of listening without interrupting. I handed him the license and supporting documents, watching as he read each page in silence. When he finished, he looked up and nodded. "They have a problem," he said simply. We discussed the options. I did not want a fight or headlines. I wanted the company to acknowledge what they had overlooked, to understand that the system they were selling was not theirs to give away. David suggested a letter, calm, factual, direct, no accusations, no threats. Just a statement the system at the heart of Northpoint's platform was covered by an active license, held in my name. He drafted the letter on his notepad, reading each line aloud as he wrote. I listened, making small corrections, insisting on the right tone. I wanted the message to be unmistakable, but not aggressive. When he finished, I signed my name at the bottom, my hand steady. David promised to send it to the board's legal team by noon. After he left, I walked through the city, feeling lighter than I had in days. I did not know how the board would react, but I knew the silence would not last. By early afternoon, my phone buzzed with missed calls, first from Paul in Human Resources, then from a number I did not recognize. I ignored them all. I was not interested in explanations or apologies. Later, Emma sent a message. "They're in chaos. Someone mentioned a license exposure in the hallway. Mark hasn't come out of his office all day." I could picture the scene, closed doors, hurried conversations, the first cracks appearing in the polished surface. I did not reply. I did not need to. The truth was already working its way through the system, slow and unstoppable. That evening, I sat by the window, watching the city lights come on one by one. I thought about the years I had given to Northpoint, about the trust I had placed in people who saw only the surface. I thought about the quiet power of a single document, filed in the right name, at the right time. Sometimes, the most important moves are the ones you make long before anyone else knows they matter. The next day, the first signs of trouble began to surface. I heard about it not from the board or from Mark, but from a former client who reached out with a simple question. "Is there a reason our portal is down?" I read the message twice, feeling a strange mix of concern and detachment. I had not touched the system since I left, but I knew its structure better than anyone. If something was failing, it was not by accident. By noon, more messages arrived. A hospital administrator I had worked with years ago reported that patient records were suddenly inaccessible. The support team at Northpoint blamed a network issue, but I recognized the pattern. The system was built to be resilient, but only if its core remained untouched. Any attempt to reconfigure it without understanding the underlying logic would cause exactly this kind of silent collapse. Emma sent a brief update. "They're calling it a minor glitch, but it's spreading." I could picture the scene engineers scrambling, managers issuing reassurances, the board demanding answers. I did not offer help or reach out. Instead, I saved every message, knowing the truth was beginning to surface on its own. Inside Northpoint, the tension must have been growing. I imagined Mark pacing his office, Paul fielding calls from frustrated clients, Linda pressing for explanations that no one could give. The system was doing what I had designed it to do, protect itself from careless hands. It was not sabotage. It was simply the result of forgetting that some things cannot be replaced with shortcuts or new names. That evening, I walked through my neighborhood, letting the cool air clear my head. I thought about the years I had spent making the system stable, the countless nights spent solving problems no one else even knew existed. I remembered the pride I felt when a client called to say everything just worked. Now, the silence from North Point was louder than any apology. As I returned home, my phone buzzed again. Another client, this time from a regional clinic, asked if I knew why their data was missing. I replied politely that I was no longer with the company, but I thanked them for reaching out. I could sense the unease growing, the realization that the foundation was not as solid as everyone had believed. I sat by my window, watching the city lights flicker, and wondered how long it would take for the board to admit what had gone wrong. I did not want to see North Point fail. I only wanted them to understand that trust, once broken, is not easily restored. The system was showing them, in its own quiet way, that the cost of forgetting is always higher than anyone expects. Inside North Point, the pressure was building. I could sense it in the way Emma's messages became shorter, more urgent. "They're pulling old contracts," she wrote one afternoon. "Someone is asking about your original notes." I pictured the boardroom Mark at the head of the table, Linda leaning forward, Paul shuffling through paperwork, the legal team whispering in the corner. No one said my name out loud, but I could feel their attention circling back to me, as if the answer to their problems was hidden somewhere in my absence. I did not respond to Emma's updates, but I read every word. I watched as the company tried to patch the system, each fix only making things worse. Clients grew restless. Some began to ask for meetings, wanting reassurance that their data was safe. The engineers worked late, but the more they tried to override the system, the more unpredictable it became. I knew exactly what they were facing. I had built the logic to be stable, but not to be tampered with by people who did not understand its design. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, I received a call from David. He did not waste time on small talk. "They're looking for a way out," he said. "The board wants to know if you'll consider a licensing agreement." I listened in silence, letting the words settle. It was not an apology, not even an admission of fault. It was a sign that the ground was shifting beneath them. I told David I would think about it. After we hung up, I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. I thought about the years I had spent building something that worked, something that mattered. I thought about the people who had once believed in the same vision, and the ones who had forgotten how it all began. That night, I gathered my old files' early drafts, handwritten diagrams, the first presentation I ever gave to the board. I watched a grainy video of myself, younger and more hopeful, explaining the system's logic to a room full of skeptics. I realized that what I had built was more than just code or process. It was a promise, one that could not be erased by a new title or a different name. As I organized the documents, I felt a quiet resolve settle in. I was not interested in revenge. I did not want to return to North Point. I only wanted the truth to be recognized, and for the people who had overlooked it to finally understand its value. The next move would be theirs, but this time, I would be ready. A few days later, David called again. This time, his tone was different, measured, with a hint of relief. "They want to meet," he said. "Not just the board's legal team. Linda will be there, and a representative from their outside counsel. They're ready to talk terms." I agreed, but insisted on a neutral location, away from North Point's glass towers and the memories that lingered in every hallway. We met in a quiet conference room downtown, the kind of place where people come to settle things they cannot fix on their own. The table was polished, the chairs stiff, the air heavy with unspoken regrets. Linda greeted me with a nod, her expression careful but not unfriendly. The outside counsel introduced himself, his words precise, his eyes never quite meeting mine. They explained the situation: system failures, client complaints, and the risk of losing major contracts. They needed a solution, and they needed it quickly. I listened without interruption. I could see the strain in Linda's posture, the way her hands fidgeted with a pen. She spoke about the company's future, about the importance of stability, about wanting to move forward in good faith. I let her finish, then asked a single question. "Who built the system you're trying to save?" There was a pause, longer than anyone expected. Finally, Linda answered, her voice quiet. You did. I nodded, feeling a calm settle over me. I explained my terms: a licensing agreement, limited in scope and time, with clear boundaries. They could use the system for 18 months, but only under strict conditions: no modifications, no public attribution, no implication that I was part of the current team. If they broke the agreement, the license would end immediately. The outside counsel reviewed the terms, his face unreadable. Linda agreed, her relief almost visible. The meeting ended with a handshake, formal but sincere. As I left the building, I felt the weight of the past few weeks begin to lift. I had not demanded an apology or recognition. I had simply made sure the truth had a cost. That evening, I walked home through the city, the air cool and clear. For the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. The system I had built would survive, but on my terms, and those who had tried to erase me would now have to remember, every day, exactly who had made it possible for them to keep going. The days after the agreement felt strangely quiet. There were no more urgent calls, no more messages from Emma about chaos in the hallways. The board had what they needed, at least for now, and Northpoint's clients were reassured by the promise of stability. I watched from a distance as the company tried to regain its footing, issuing careful statements and quietly updating contracts. Mark was no longer mentioned in any announcements. His absence was never explained, but I could imagine the stories that circulated behind closed doors. I spent my time putting my own life back together. I met with David to finalize the licensing paperwork, making sure every clause was clear and every deadline precise. The agreement was strict: 18 months, no modifications, no public mention of my name, and a clear end date. I wanted boundaries, not just for them, but for myself. I needed to know that what I had built would not be used as a shortcut for someone else's ambition again. Emma reached out once, a short message that simply read, "Thank you." I did not reply, but I felt a quiet sense of closure. She had always understood more than she let on. I hoped she would find her own way forward, away from the shadows of other people's decisions. As the weeks passed, I watched Northpoint from afar. The company stabilized, but it was different now, more cautious, less certain. Some clients returned, but others moved on. Unwilling to risk another disruption, the board kept their distance, honoring every term of the agreement. I received the first payment on time, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had changed. I did not celebrate. Instead, I focused on what came next, beginning to sketch out new ideas and reaching out to people I trusted, people who valued the work for what it was, not just for what it could earn. For the first time in years, I felt free to build without looking over my shoulder. One evening, as I walked past Northpoint's building, I saw the lights on in the top-floor conference room. I wondered if anyone inside remembered how it all began, or if they only saw the numbers on a balance sheet. I kept walking, the city alive around me, and realized that sometimes the best victories are the ones that leave you lighter, not heavier. As the months passed, I found myself settling into a new rhythm. The weight I had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of possibility. I spent my days working on projects that mattered to me, reaching out to former colleagues who had left Northpoint for their own reasons. Some joined me, drawn by the chance to build something from the ground up, free from the politics and shifting loyalties that had haunted our old company. Word spread quietly. Clients who had once relied on Northpoint began to call, asking if I could help them transition to a new system. I listened to their concerns, remembering the trust we had built together in the early days. I promised only what I knew I could deliver: stability, transparency, and a team that understood the value of doing things right the first time. Emma joined us a few months later. She arrived with little fanfare, slipping into the new office with the same quiet determination I remembered from her first days as an intern. She brought news from Northpoint: how the company was still struggling to regain its footing, how the board was focused on meeting the terms of the agreement, how the culture had changed in ways that made it hard for anyone to feel at home. We worked late, but the hours felt different. There was no sense of dread, no fear of being replaced or forgotten. Every decision was ours to make, every success shared. I watched as our small team grew, not through flashy announcements or aggressive recruiting, but through word of mouth and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are building something real. One afternoon, as I looked around the office at the people who had chosen to be there, I realized how far we had come. The past still lingered, but it no longer defined us. We were building a new foundation, one that could not be taken away by a change in leadership or a line in a contract. Sometimes, I would walk past North Point's building on my way home. The lights were still on, but the place felt smaller now, as if the energy that once filled its halls had faded. I did not feel anger or regret, only a sense of gratitude for the lessons I had learned, and for the freedom to start again on my own terms. 18 months passed, and the agreement with North Point quietly expired. There was no ceremony, no final meeting, just a simple notice from their legal team confirming the end of their right to use the system I had built. I watched as the company tried to rebuild, searching for a way to replace what they had once taken for granted. Some clients stayed, but many moved on, unwilling to risk another disruption. The board sent a polite inquiry about a possible extension, but this time, I declined. By then, my own company had found its footing. We had grown, not through noise or marketing, but through trust and steady results. Our clients valued the clarity and stability we offered, and our team worked with a sense of purpose I had not felt in years. Emma flourished in her new role, and others who had once felt overlooked found their voices and their place. Sometimes, I thought back to those early days at North Point, the long nights, the quiet victories, the belief that loyalty would be enough. I understood now that the real foundation of any company is not just the technology or the contracts, but the people who care enough to build something that lasts. When that is forgotten, everything else eventually falls away. I did not seek revenge or hope for North Point to fail. I only wanted the truth to matter, for the cost of erasure to be felt by those who thought they could rewrite history without consequence. In the end, the company survived, but it was changed smaller, quieter, and, I hoped, a little wiser. As for me, I moved forward. Carrying the lessons and the freedom I had earned, I knew now that beginnings are rarely recognized for what they are, and endings are often quieter than we expect. But somewhere in between, if you are lucky, you get the chance to build something that cannot be erased. So if you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever watched your work become someone else's story, know this: the truth has a way of surfacing, and sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that last the longest.